On today's episode of Diksha, we are going to look at the purpose of government. A lot of emphasis is being placed on the ruling government and its ability to make decisions and to properly guide the country or the nation. And this not only applies to the local scene here in Trinidad and Tobago, but it also applies internationally. We see it in America and Europe and in Asia, everywhere, that a lot of people are expecting a lot of the government in terms of proper decision making. They are expecting the government to really guide the entire population in a positive direction for positive growth, to minimize poverty and suffering. And a lot of, the government has a very broad portfolio in all countries. Now, I wanted to take a step back a little and we can look at how the structure was in the past in terms of we are looking at when there were kings and emperors. Now, in the past, there were not really, diplomatic governments in place. There were no real parliaments. It was, in a way, pioneered in the Roman times, but even in that sense, we had the Roman emperors. So, but all cultures functioned with the king as the head of state. And not so much the king as the head of state, but the crown or the ruling position of the crown as the head of state. And this is the reason for this is because the crown was passed down to replace kings. As the kings got older, some kings, like for example in India, they would retire at a certain age and pass the crown to their successor. So, more importantly, the crown ruled the kingdom. Now, what this represents when we say the crown is the law of the land. So the law of the land was decided by one person, and that person was the king. The king was the law. The king decided all states. The king had final decision in all matters of the state. The king was the one who made all the decisions. Now, the king would have advisors, obviously, because the king would not be an expert or up to date with all the matters of state at any given point in time. So the king will have advisors, and later on these advisors will come to be known as ministers. So eventually the king would have ministers. They will have advisors who are experts in their fields, their relative fields. And the ministers obviously will have their advisors and their people on the ground who would have the day-to-day information that would be relayed to the minister, and the minister would relay this information to the king, and the king would make a decision based on what was presented. So this was the system previously in, let's say, the whole world. All of the world functioned in this way. And empires were basically a collection of kingdoms that also had at its head one person. So the system was basically extended from the individual kings of the individual states from the ministers who had advised the emperor. Now, in modern times, over the last 100 years, so not relatively speaking, it's not that old, we have developed a parliament system or a democratic system. Even in countries that traditionally functioned under a ruling king or crown, such as England, most all European countries, We have, for example, Asian countries. Japan still has as its figurehead an emperor. So we have where the crown is now more a figure, a symbol of the state. Now the reason I point out the position of the king in a state is because the king was the law. And this is what we did with a democracy. We took the king, who was the law, and replaced the king with a constitution, which is the law of the land. So where previously the king was the absolute law of the land, whatever he said went or goes, we replace that in a democracy with the constitution. Now the constitution is the law of the land. And now so let's call the constitution king. From the king, we have the ministers, which in their respective fields will be expert and will have advice to pass on to the king, which is the constitution. Which means the ministers will formulate ideas and laws and bills and plans to be presented, to be included in the mind of the king as law. So we have taken that person to person process and put it on a paper to paper process. So we have the king. In a democracy, we have, in essence, a king, law, which is the constitution. From there, we have the ministers who would advise and formulate and put forward ideas to the constitution that will contribute towards the constitution. And from the ministers, when we come down the ladder, we have those who would advise the ministers and provide input to the ministers, who would be, let's say, leaders in their respective fields, which is business or commerce, any form of activity that will affect directly the decision-making process of the ministers. And then we follow this down the ladder, and then we reach to the average individual. Now, what this translates to is that the same way in the imperial times with the crown was the law of the land, the highest power. Even the ministers couldn't supersede the law of the land, the king. He couldn't, unless you committed treason or unless you were insubordinate to the crown. Now take this and apply it to the democratic process, that a minister still acts in accordance with the constitution, in accordance to the wishes of the king, which is the law of the land. And so the whole process is now structured paper to paper instead of person to person. Now, this brings me to the point of what the general public expects of the ministers or the government, which is we as a general public expect the ministers or the government to serve the people. But on paper, this is not the purpose of a government or the ministers or the parliament. Their purpose is to serve the king and to act in the best interest of the king. The same way in medieval times, the parliament or the ministers and advisors to the king acted, in theory, for the benefit of the kingdom and the crown. All we did is replace a person with the constitution. So the parliament and the ministers, in theory, act for the benefit of the law of the land, not for the people of the land. Now, what I'm saying is not that they don't act in the benefit of the people, in that they don't care about the people. What I mean is, the law of the land is structured in a way to maintain order and to maintain, let's say, the survivability or the progress of the nation as a whole, as one. That is the purpose of the king, to ensure that his kingdom progresses and prospers. In the same way, the constitution is there to make sure that the nation progresses and prospers. The ministers serve the king, the constitution. They don't serve the people. In other words, they serve to ensure that the nation moves forward. And that's their job. Now this slight change in thought is the difference between complaining that the government is not helping the people and realizing what the true purpose of a government is. That, well, ideally the government's purpose, one, is not to serve the people. So where do we go from here? Knowing that, or seeing that the government's role is not to serve the people, the interests of the person, and by the people I mean my individual interests and your individual interests are not factored in the government's decision-making process, because that's plain and simple not their job. But it's not that we as an individual don't have a voice or a role in the nation. What I mean by this is that the king's agenda is to have his kingdom prosper. The constitution's agenda is to have the nation prosper. The minister's agenda, as long as it's in line with the king or constitution, is to ensure that the king prospers, makes the best decisions, makes the right alliances, all these things. But that's their role. The ministers have people who would advise them, who are, let's say, the well-to-do or the well-off members of society, who would not be ministers themselves, but because of their social standing or financial standing in society, through their own work. For example, big businessmen or people who control, let's say, religious organizations or unions, all these things, they influence the ministers because they themselves have influence over a majority, a fraction of the population. So these leaders influence the ministers, who in turn influence the king or the constitution. Now, the leaders have under their command, let's say in society, intelligent individuals and people who are striving within their own field to prosper. And under these individuals, as we come lower down, we have individuals who, let's say me for example, who is striving in my own field to prosper. So what it is individuals at the ground level, each striving in their own field to prosper, will put forth qualities that benefit that group. So a group of farmers would choose somebody, the best among them, to represent that group in their interests. And then the group, and as you have more groups of farmers, you have more groups of, then you will have a group of people who express interest for the farmers, and then it'll climb the ladder to business people, and then from there we go to major business people, and then major business people will advise the agriculture minister, for example, and the agriculture minister will advise the constitution in terms of what is beneficial for the the nation to progress. Now, this is where the power of the individual comes in that it's the individual's aspiration to progress that leads ultimately to the king or the constitution. And I'm saying king with the understanding that the king is a person, but the constitution is the literary equivalent of a king. It both have the same role, both fulfill the same function. One is just paper and one is just a person, but they both fulfill the same function in a nation. So it's each individual's drive to prosper and progress that ultimately leads to the progress of the nation, which is the constitution. So that is the power of the individual in this entire system. It's not the place for the constitution of the country to benefit the individual to that extent that it's one-on-one, that from the parliamentary level or the constitutional level, that it directly benefits one individual. It's a logistical impossibility for the constitution or the king to individually influence the prosperity of each individual in a country. And that's just not the place, that's not the purpose of it. Now, being that this is Diksha, and the purpose of Diksha is to discuss universal principles or Sanatan Dharmic principles, this fundamentally falls under Sanatan Dharma or Sanatan Dharmic principle, in that if we look at the universe or the multi-dimensional environment that we live in, everything is governed by laws. The king is a representative of the laws of a nation. The constitution is now representative of the laws of a nation. And the universe itself functions with laws, some of which can be, once we learn them, can be adjusted for our own individual needs, and some of them we really cannot escape. And this is Sanatan Dharma. In the same way, we as people have created a miniature version of the universe in terms of our social structure, or the nation, or let's say, for example, a grouping of nations like the United Kingdom or the Commonwealth nations. So we have taken, with our understanding of how the universe works and an understanding of ourselves, we have taken that model and superimposed it on a nation, a social structure. It is in this sense that we must realize, in the same way that the universe works with fixed laws that cannot be escaped. And I should be very careful here to say that I'm not talking about dictatorship laws. I'm talking about, let's say, the spirit of the Constitution is that the Constitution stands highest above all else. The king stands highest above all else in the nation. They represent the final law. Then this is where we see where constitutionally no one is above the law, and that's literally no one individual, no matter their position in the nation, in a kingdom, is above the king. Constitution, nobody is above the Constitution. Everybody serves the Constitution. Everybody serves the king. So what happens when a person acts as though they supersede the king in a nation. Well, we have civil unrest, we have conflict, we have a coup or an attempt to overthrow the king. We have all these things that could happen that adversely affect a nation. And in the same way, when we go against the laws of nature, it's an Dharmic principle that if we were to go against the laws of nature, it leads to catastrophe. So we are looking at this from in a comparative nature, in a comparative sense, that if I am looking at nature with Sanatana Dharmic principle, you cannot go against the laws of nature. Any attempt to go against the laws of nature leads to catastrophe. And by catastrophe, we mean like disastrous effects. In the same way, in the system that we have built, any attempt to go against the laws of the king leads to catastrophic events happening. Because that's how it is. If we, in building our system, see that a law or if in advising the king, as in old times, the king saw fit to make an adjustment to his way of thinking or laws, he would do so in consideration for the progress of the nation. In the same way too, the ministers take into consideration what is best for the nation and make adjustments to the constitution in the same way they advise the constitution. So, the same way that you would go against nature and fail, the same way going against the constitution fails. It's directly relatable. And this is where we need to be conscious. It's not that constitutions cannot be changed. It's not that people cannot progress. It's that it's planning and acting with an awareness that laws cannot be broken. Now, all this plays into a greater universal principle, which is the yugs. Now, in a previous episode of Diksha, we covered the yugs, which are Satya Yug, Dwapara Yug, Treta Yug, and Kali Yug. So the yugs are universal principles, and as covered in the previous episode of Diksha, although yes, we have the major, let's say in terms of when the universe was created to when the universe will end, that if we look at that timeline, we have the 4 yugs happening, but there are also miniature timelines within that one great timeline, and all of these in themselves have these 4 yugs. And even as previously mentioned, in our day, we have the 4 yugs taking place. There's a time of rising and there's a time of setting in the day. The moments and relationships in our lives. In the same way too, the principles apply to a nation and the laws and the kings and the constitution, in that there are ideas which will rise and there are ideas which will fall. There are laws which will rise and there are laws which will fall, because there are certain lifetimes for each one of these things. So to say that that we have built a constitution or we have put a king in place and that is there till the end of time, that's very unrealistic, because, well, honestly speaking, there are a lot of nations that have existed that no longer exist today. They would have had their kings and they would have had their own constitutions, but each of one of these things have a lifetime. And this is a symbol of change within a nation. When laws change, when ideas change, philosophies change. And this is how we grow as people and progress. So it's not, let's say when we look at the constitution, or we look at laws, or we look at new ideas coming into play at the parliamentary level or the constitutional level, that it is so much that it is an attack on the individual, because we are looking at the lifetime of a nation, the lifetime of a constitution, which in itself would have yugs. It will have learning periods, it will have periods of sustenance, and it will have periods where a particular idea is broken down and is discarded and a new idea takes place. And this is the major, let's say, coupling of ideas, is that the government doesn't serve the people, in that the purpose of the parliament and the ministers and the government is to serve the constitution or laws. And so there will be the cycle of yugs happening in that sphere with regard to the yugs of law. So that's why through this whole explanation I'm trying to just put forth the idea that there is a universal principle that plays out in this scenario of governance and of parliament and of kings and constitutions. And that in itself is a lifetime of its own. It involves a lifetime of a nation, and there are individuals living in a nation, but the nation itself as an entity is going through a lifetime. So my main focus of bringing this point is to bring to light the idea that the governments don't serve people. They have their constitution or their kings to serve, and the happiness of the individual is up to the individual. The success of the individual is up to the individual, and progress of the individual is up to the individual. And I'm not saying that it is up to us to break laws or to create our own laws without regard for the laws of the nation. What I am saying is our happiness is our responsibility, because as an individual, my role is to satisfy the laws that govern my life, which include the constitutional laws. So this is the simple idea I wanted to put forth, which would I hope will bring about a slight shift in the point of view we take when looking at the role of government in our lives and the role of ministers in our lives. And probably we could by looking at it like this, we can really find solutions instead of placing blame on people who have not met our needs. So, no, I am not trying to defend anybody, and this is no way meant to be a political matter. I've merely drawn a tangent or a connection from the constitutional end and the political end, and linked the lifetime of those things to the universal principles and ideas which govern existence itself. So I hope there's no confusion in thinking that Diksha has gone political. It's merely a observation of thought. So I hope you enjoyed my presentation for today, and I hope it opens up the minds a little bit and frees up the thought process a little bit. And saying thank you for joining me on Diksha. Like always, you can leave a comment on our Facebook page or email us at info@sankyatv.com. And I will see you next time.